The sun had just begun to rise on a dusty field of tall grass outside of the city of Thebes in ancient Greece. Young Alcmene, daughter of Perseus, gave birth to her son, Heracles, bastard child of Zeus. Now, knowing that the mere birth of Heracles would incite the wrath of Hera, Alcmene left him in a field and fled back to the city. While on a walk, Hera and her holy sister Athena discovered the infant lying, crying in the grass. Hera picked him up and brought him to her breast, where she nursed him, only for an instant, but that one drop of milk made Heracles immortal. And he sucked too hard and caused Hera great pain, and immediately she dropped him onto the ground. Now, seeing that her interference had led to Heracles achieving immortality, and knowing and discovering that he was the son of Zeus, Hera decided that she must take revenge. And so, she finds two of the most poisonous serpents in all of Greece, and under cover of darkness, slips them into the bedchamber where Heracles was sleeping in his crib alongside his mother, Alcmene. The serpents slithered into the crib and wrapped and coiled themselves around the neck of the infant Heracles and began to strangle him. Outside the door, Hera heard one quick scream before she heard laughter. She peered into the room and saw Heracles holding both snakes by his hands like rattlesnakes, or like rattles, having crushed them to death in his infant hands. Amphitryon burst into the room, upset by the commotion and fearful for his young stepson. Seeing the power exhibited by young Heracles, the very next morning, Amphitryon brought him to an oracle, who informed him that Heracles would live a life of adventure and glory and heroics. And so, emboldened by this knowledge, Amphitryon knew that he must prepare his child properly. And as a high-ranking official within the city, it was within his power to provide Heracles with the best training possible. And so, from the most skilled practitioners from across Thebes, Heracles learned hunting and gathering and foraging and skinning animals and wrestling and boxing and sword fighting and swimming and rock climbing and all of the skills that would be absolutely essential for an adventurer to have. However, while Heracles was a great learner, he was also quick to anger and was not one to put up with abuse. And so, while learning music from the finest musician in all of Thebes, Heracles could not quite hit the right note on his instrument, and so the teacher backhanded Heracles and lectured him and told him why he was terrible. And in return, Heracles hurled his instrument at the teacher and beheaded him in one instant. Fearful of his son's power, Amphitryon had Heracles sent to the fields where he would tend to the sheep and the cattle, far away from the dense population of Thebes. And for many years, this was where Heracles lived, working into his young adulthood, until eventually he decided that he had had enough of working in the fields and went out to a solitary land to determine how he would proceed with his life. And while there, he met two women. One who introduced herself as Idle Pleasure, who offered the quick and easy path towards a life of riches and splendor, filled with delicious nectars of the most perfect fruit and all of the pleasures that Heracles could imagine. And the other, known only as Virtue, reminded Heracles that the immortals provide nothing to man without toil and strife. And if he wanted to truly live a life that sucked the nectar out of earth, then live a life full of heroics and adventure, that he must walk the harder path, the path of the warrior, the one that will not bring him peace. And Heracles told these two women that he didn't have an answer right away. He wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his life yet. But he knew that after this encounter, he knew that he must return to Thebes. And so, on the long walk back, Heracles pondered his position, not sure if he wanted to be a warrior even, if that was even what he should do, despite being told by many that that was his destiny. He could take the easy path, or he could take the hard path and not know what comes in the future. And upon returning to Thebes, Heracles still was not sure what he should do. However, this was the age of beasts. So across the land there reigned terrifying creatures that would threaten villagers across Greece. And so, upon returning home to Thebes, Heracles heard of the fiercest one, the great lion of Mount Kithaeron. And now, upon hearing how it threatened the livestock that lay and grazed just below its cave, Heracles knew what he must do. Now, as a hero, it was his destiny to slay this lion. And so, he outfitted himself with his armor and a sword and a knife, and he trudged up the mountain. He walked up and stepped into the cave, into the darkness, where he heard only a snarl and the drip of saliva off of a fang. The lion leaped out of the darkness and lunged at Heracles, who, with his god-like speed, dodged out of the way and wrapped his big arms around the lion and tackled it to the ground. And while the two were struggling on the ground and slamming each other into boulders, Heracles pulled out his knife and beheaded the lion and took its head as his own. For the next few hours, he skinned the beast and wore its pelt on his back and mounted its jaws atop his head into a great helm. And so, having slayed the mighty beast, Heracles walked back down the mountain to the applause of the citizens of Thebes, where he was treated and regaled as a cunning warrior. However, the grace period did not last long, as Heracles was quickly alerted to the presence of messengers from the nearby kingdom of Orchomenus, ruled by the fierce tyrant Erginus, who demanded yearly extortionist tributes from the city of Thebes, ones that they could not consistently afford. And so, not liking how his people were being oppressed and deciding that he was now the champion of oppressors, Heracles went to those messengers and cut off all of their hands, their noses, and their ears, and sent them back to Erginus mutilated and bloody. Now, knowing that there would be consequences for his actions, and that Erginus would undoubtedly retaliate in force, Heracles knew that he must rouse the townspeople to fight for him, and that if they couldn't, if there truly was no good in man, then their city was as good as done, and their women and their buildings and their people destroyed. And so, for the next few weeks, as Erginus gathered his forces, Heracles was training his. And they practiced and they fought, and Heracles made them into the best warriors that he could make them in such a short span of time. But there was still one problem. Along with their tributes, the minions had gathered all of the weapons and tools that any Theban could use as a weapon or to protect themselves from the minions, and taken it back to their city. So, Heracles led his band of merry men up to the temple of Athena, and as he had always had good relations with the goddess, he knew that she would help him. And so, she bestowed upon him a spear and armor to aid him in his conquest. And for his men, thanks to the noble tributes of their forefathers, there were many weapons still sitting in the temple. And so the men armed themselves and set off to battle the minions, who had a much larger force. And they met them at a narrow pass so that the minions' power and strength in numbers would be not so much of an advantage. The battle was long and hard, and many good Thebans died, along with noble, brave King Amphitryon. After seeing his father struck down in a hailstorm of arrows, Heracles made a beeline for Erginus and quickly beheaded him. And then, once the battle was over, he rushed to Amphitryon's side and cradled his dying father in his arms and thanked him for everything that he had done. And as Amphitryon slowly died, Heracles was filled with a rage, a burning fire from the underworld of pure rage. And him and his men set out to the city of Orchomenus, and in a single day they burned the entire city to the ground and leveled its great buildings and monuments, never to trifle with Thebes again. And so Heracles and his brave men returned to the city of Thebes, where they were treated and regaled as brave heroes. The men were all noted in history books and remembered forever. And Heracles, well, cowardly King Creon, who had refused to do anything about Erginus, knelt before Heracles and offered him his firstborn and most beautiful daughter as his wife, to which Heracles graciously accepted, and would later have 3 brave, heroic children with her. As well, the gods finally looked favorably on Heracles, and they gave him various magical tools, including a golden sword from Hermes, arrows from Apollo, a magical quiver from Hephaestus, and a cuirass from Athena. And with the gods in his favor, Heracles knew that this would be the first of many adventures of Heracles.